ahead and get started on our discussion today around confidentiality and databases. And this is going to be a quick overview. For those of you that were able to attend the regional meetings that Beth Meeks and myself presented at, this is that same presentation. We might just talk a little bit more about some other things, but there also might be, you know, if you're new to this information, it takes a couple of times to start to hear information about, especially technology and databases.
Your conference is being recorded.
If that's not where you sort of live every day, to make sure that you're clear on it. If you have specific questions, you can certainly put those into the chat box and we'll answer those as we can. But as I said, on October 6th, we'll also have a peer-to-peer call about databases and confidentiality. So if you want to be able to do some more of a follow-up, ask some more specific questions, and we absolutely encourage you to be part of that conversation as well. I will also just say, for those of you that are still getting familiar with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, we do have, we're broken into teams, and so I am on our Capacity Technical Assistance team, but we have a team that is also called the Safety Net team. And the Safety Net team works specifically on issues related to databases, confidentiality, technology, and stalking. They work very closely with large tech companies such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, around increasing safety and security for survivors, and they've got really great information on a website that we'll make sure we give you at the end. So just to make sure that you're aware that this PowerPoint that you're seeing, you'll see Cindy Southworth here. She is the founder of the Safety Net project, and so she was the one who created this PowerPoint. So as we get started, we really just want to think about sort of what are those confidentiality requirements. And again, if you're working with local programs, you know, everybody wants to get a database. Everybody's into the databases for a lot of different reasons, and databases can be a good thing to have. But they want to think about their confidentiality requirements. And when you're monitoring programs, when you're talking with programs, it's something that you want to make sure that you're emphasizing with them, that you're checking for, and that you're addressing, right? So if they're receiving, while FIPSA is really focused on this, grantees are also getting VOCA, they're getting VAWA funds, and their provisions are really similar. All right, so we just want to keep reminding our programs that we don't have a split between those three major federal funding sources, right? So it's pretty similar across the board in terms of what the expectation is in terms of confidentiality. So they want to be following those regardless of the funding sources that they're getting. We're going to do a brief overview over database questions to consider and just a couple of definitions. And then we'll think about materials and resources and what's needed, right? So this is oftentimes you're going to find is not necessarily a one-and-done conversation with some of your programs. Hopefully they come to you in the beginning before they purchase something, but if they have not and they've gone and made a purchase already, there may be lots of these questions that are coming up. But if they have come to you before they purchase something, you might be now better in a position after this presentation to think through some of those questions to help them sort of ask so that they can make a much more informed buying decision regarding these databases and thinking about their confidentiality. So as I said, this is just a little overview of our Safety Net project that it addresses the intersection between technology, DV, sexual violence, dating abuse, and stalking. So we know that we live in a world where technology has become more and more prevalent. It is part of our everyday lives. It is part of the lives of the survivors that are served by the programs. So we cannot separate people from their technology, which was kind of our original, as cell phones and as things became more prevalent, right, was kind of the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of local DV programs. What we want to say is that we do not want programs taking cell phones. We don't want them taking laptops or removing things from people or taking the battery out and making those things disabled. We want to help programs, right? We want to help advocates be better able to respond what those needs are for survivors, recognize the intersection and the misuse of technology by abusers. They provide education and assistance to victim advocates, governments, right? So we talk again about how tech is misused, how to keep data safe and confidential, because it's not just, and sometimes programs, if you're working with a program and they're like, oh, well, we just take people's cell phones, well, that sort of makes the assumption that the only people in the shelter that are using any type of technology that puts people at risk is the survivor, without sort of the recognition that the program and our use of technology could also be creating a risk, right? So we want to think about how we're keeping data safe and confidential. How victims can relocate and use technology safely. So technology can be used safely, but it's like anything else around safety planning. It's done based upon who that perpetrator is. Survivors can put in as many measures as possible, but if they have a pretty tech-savvy partner or ex-partner, right, that person may find ways to constantly get around that. And those aren't things that we then want to blame survivors for, right? We want to hold the appropriate person accountable, which is the perpetrator. And obviously, we want to make sure that our agencies are using technology effectively, and we want to make sure people are complying with the confidentiality requirements in whichever method they choose to go. We want to advocate for survivor-centered policies and practices, right, which is the core of our work. Everything should be survivor-centered. We want to advise the tech companies on privacy and safety. So some of this isn't necessarily, so this is where we start thinking about systems advocacy. So it's not necessarily what the survivor is doing with technology. They have limits in terms of what they can do, but if we can actually work with the companies that create the technology where they can put some more safety measures in place, and that increases the safety, not just for survivors, but for everybody. And then they're also launching sister safety net projects in different countries. So the Netherlands, Australia, we actually have a staff person for NNEDV who's been in Australia, I believe, now for a year, helping Australia get their safety net project up. Ireland, and just recently we had staff in Finland, and we just had staff over in London. So the safety net project has really taken off worldwide. So let's sort of start talking about kind of what is this, right, about in terms of our government funding. So in 84, right, in 94, in 2005, in 2010, right, so as we continue to get reauthorization of VAWAs, right, as FIPS that continue to get reauthorized, what we know, right, is that government funding for victim services plus our individual survivor information. So the fact that we started getting that government funding, plus we need to make sure that we were containing survivor information, means that the survivor really gets to control the disclosure of that information. Ultimately, that is what we need to understand about confidentiality, that it's not our information, it is really the survivor's information at all times, and the survivor gets to really decide when that information gets disclosed, who it gets disclosed to, and always has a right to say, I no longer want that information to be given. When we talk about personally identifying information, and this is often a place where you may hear some of your programs talk about, oh, well, it's just the person's name or something like that. While, yes, your name is personally identifying information, and we'll talk more about other forms of personally identifying information, that information still belongs to the survivor. It is still controlled by the survivor, and it is only disclosed by the survivor. So that includes things like their name, the number of their children, race, right, anything that could come back to them, or any combination of information that could identify them. So when we think about how those federal provisions protect our victim information, what we're looking at here is that it really has been legally codified. So if some of your programs are like, well, where does it say that at, or we don't follow that, we follow HIPAA guidelines, or we follow this, or we follow that, you may need to pull out these sections and just make sure that people understand that this really has been codified language around our provision to protect victim information. So you'll see all of the various sections where you can find that information at, including the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. So if you're working with programs in there, obviously for purposes of homelessness, folks fleeing domestic violence are considered homeless, and their children are also then considered homeless and fall under the McKinney-Vento Act in terms of being able to access education. and the school doesn't need to require all this information for children to get started, right? Which is sort of what the McKinney-Vento Act says, that because they're homeless and that's what they need to be able to show to be able to get into school. What is prohibited? So what's prohibited is that we can't share the personal identifying information about victims, again, without informed, written, reasonably time-limited consent. And you see we keep saying this over and over and over again, right? So this is critically important. We cannot share this information without informed, written, reasonably time-limited consent. Even if we as advocates think this is critically important, somebody should know this, we need to share this with somebody. Even if the survivor said, oh yeah, don't worry about it, go ahead and share that, right? We don't want verbal, it needs to be written consent, right? We really need to pay attention to that and make sure, right, when we're going out and we're talking with programs and we're working with advocates that, you know, look at that release form that they're having people sign, right? Have them walk you through that and talk about how they fill that out, how do they present that to folks. As you know, the other thing that's also really important under FIPSA is that all services are voluntary. So survivors should never be made to feel like they have to sign a release. They have to be willing to give up information in order to maintain services for them and their children. Val and Book also prohibit the disclosure of individual information without written consent, and confidentiality grant guidelines prohibit programs from making the signing and release a condition of service, right? So again, it all needs to be voluntary. So how can they make sure that they want their, if I want my information shared and I'm a survivor, how do I do that? So I need to make sure that it is very narrow in terms of what gets shared, and that means that as an advocate, it is incumbent upon me to talk to a survivor about what a release of information really means, who they want information released to, and to also talk about the consequences of once we put this information out there, right? Once we share this information, you and I lose control over where that information goes or how it gets used. And that's not always fully explained to survivors, and so by other agencies. So we want to make sure that when we, right, as domestic violence programs, are working with folks, that really is something that is explained and that is explained clearly, and that the survivor gets to say, I want you to tell, let's say it's my TANF worker, I'm okay with you telling my TANF worker this, but I don't want them to know this about me, right? So you can verify for them that I have my 3 kids with me, but I don't want you to disclose anything about my abuse history. I don't want them to know anything about whatever, right? So survivors should be able to tell us that, right? It also needs to be time specific. So there is sort of a general practice that happens around releases where people sort of do open-ended releases for 60 or 90 days, and they make them pretty general. And this was when I was a chemical dependency counselor, this was sort of how I had people fill out a release, which was, you know, their name, the name of sort of the agency, so it wasn't specific to a person. It was, you know, Job and Family Services, and then any and all records pertaining to Jane Doe, and then I would have Jane Doe sign it, and it would be dated to expire 90 days from the date of that signature. Those are not the kind of releases that we should be seeing, right? We want very specific and time-limited releases. So who am I releasing this information to? So not just Job and Family Services, but who is the caseworker that I'm giving this information to? What information am I getting, right? Not just any and all records or pertaining to this person, right? But I'm releasing information specifically about dates of birth of children or number of children present in the family, whatever it is, right? Length of time in the shelter, whatever is needed for the survivor to be able to access those services. So we want to make sure that we are, and that we're looking for, and again, a great way to do this is to have advocates really walk you through that process of how do they explain that to someone. So the best way to remember this, there's a little acronym called WIT, right? So written, informed, reasonably time limited. So what's reasonable? So if it takes me 3 days, right? So if I get you to sign a release on Monday and I'm trying to get in touch with your worker, and I know we may end up playing phone tag or something like that, I could easily just have you sign a release for a week. What if I don't get in touch with that caseworker for a week? Well, the release can have a space that allows me to have the survivor come back and sign and give me time to extend it for another week quite easily, right? There also should be a place where it can be revoked in writing or revoked verbally. So we don't want to use verbal consent for survivors to say like, oh yeah, you can go ahead and give that information. We always want that in writing. But a survivor can always say, I don't want you to talk to those people anymore. And then we can go on the form and we can date stating this was the date of verbal revocation, okay? So we do not want to use blanket releases. So if you're going in and you're seeing blanket releases, this would be a conversation that you would want to have about best practices. So there are some times when we have to share information that we don't necessarily require, that's not required under a release. And these are very specific cases. So very limited sharing, and this is where there may be child abuse. So if your advocate in your state is a mandated reporter under state law, right, then I'm going to have to report. But even then, I need to only report the information that's required under state law. I can't go above and beyond that scope. I can't participate in the investigation without a signed release. If it's not clear, right, whether or not they're mandated reporters, and so this, I don't know if this is something you would necessarily know as the state administrators. Maybe you do. Maybe if you're not sure, maybe it's something for you to research. Your coalition may be like, yep, our advocates are definitely right there in the state law, or it's not really clear. I'm from Ohio. Our workers are not, advocates are not spelled out in our state law as mandated reporters of child abuse, right? But if there's a duty, but if they suspect that something's going on, that doesn't mean that they don't do anything, right? It just means that their process needs to be different, so they're not violating confidentiality under VAWA or under FIPSA or VOCA, right? Now, if there's a duty to warn, right, so if a survivor says, I'm going to kill my partner, right, and we know that survivors get very frustrated at times. We know that they're under a great deal of stress. We know that they're experiencing trauma. Right? We know lots of things are going on, and we know batterers know how to push against all of those soft spots. And so in that, you may absolutely get a batterer who is constantly harassing the partner, threatening her, doing all those kind of things, and she may say one day, oh my gosh, I wish he was dead, right? Or I'm going to kill him. That does not necessarily require a duty to warn, right? Now, if she says, I'm going to kill him next Tuesday, and I bought a gun, and I'm going to shoot him, then that's a very clear and specific plan, and that may be something, that's something then that we would have to provide a warning for. Again, your workers should be very aware of the rules as it relates to when they have to do a duty to warn and what information they need to provide, and not go beyond that information so that they can maintain confidentiality. Same thing if somebody is if they are a risk to themselves or so if I'm threatening suicide, that's another reason why I may have to break confidentiality in order to get somebody help or assistance. So regardless of the information it's been, when we think about in terms of disclosing, revealing, or releasing personal identification, it has to have been encoded, encrypted, hashed, otherwise protected. So grantees must not disclose, reveal, or release any personal identifying information, right? So even if your tech guy says, oh, don't worry, it's completely encoded, it's encrypted, no one can ever see it, that is not necessarily enough for us to still feel like we can disclose, reveal, or release that information. The other thing is that under VAWA regulations, our grantees have to make reasonable effort to make sure that we're not inadvertently disclosing information, right? especially when we're using like a third-party database or any sort of internal database that's managed by an outside company, and we're going to talk about that. So if your local programs are saying, oh yeah, we bought this database and it says this or it says that, here's where they need to start asking some real questions about the level of privacy and encoding and not just trust the company when they say, oh no, we can't see it. So what is the information we're concerned about disclosing when we talk about personally identifying information? So as you look at this list, first name, physical address, contact information, right, and that can be any of those things that are listed there, a social security number, driver's license number. These are things I would say, one, I cannot think of any reason why a program would need to collect social security information, driver's license, passport, right? Like, if they are collecting that information, I would probably ask some questions around why are they collecting that, or sort of what's leading them to believe that they need to collect that information. I often found when I was working with programs that some of them that were collecting this thought that they had to collect it for a funder, but that was because somebody had told them when they started, like, oh, we collect this information for a funder, and somebody had told that person. It was just one of those things like, we've been collecting it for like 10 years now, and no one's ever stopped to question, like, which funder and why are we collecting this, right? Or any other information. So things that we collect in terms of demographics, right? So date of birth, racial or ethnic background. Typically, you know, if you're collecting religious affiliation, again, not necessarily something you would need, but any of these individually or a combination can be used to identify a person. So we really have to stop and think about how we are reporting data and looking at data. So this slide here really talks about how do we identify people. So if we look at the bottom, if we just look at date of birth and their zip code, right, if I know your gender, that means I can identify you 87.1% of the time with just those couple little pieces of information, your five-digit zip code, your date of birth, and gender. Those three pieces of information will allow me to identify someone 87% of the time, all right, which is incredible. And so I don't even have to have your name. So this is more than just, oh, I just need to have a name. But I think that we need to really talk to our programs about this is why we don't want to have any of this information sort of laid out, or as we're reporting it, that we're reporting individual information. This is why we really need to think about reporting information much more in terms of the aggregate form. So before I move into questions to consider, I see Alyssa has put a thing in here. People feel they need to have a Social Security number for housing funding. That may be for housing funding. What I would say is that if they are collecting it for that purpose, do they need the full Social Security number, or are they just collecting the last four? Where is that number being stored at? If it's going into HMIS, that's not necessarily a fully secure database because it can be used as a case management database, so lots of people can have information or have access to that information. So that can absolutely put survivors at risk in terms of that. Do people have a right to say, I don't want to give that information, and are still able to access services, or still be able, like, so if I'm going for rapid rehousing funds, if I don't give my Social Security number, can I still get that? Or is there some way that I get kicked out of the system because my information is not full and complete? So I would just ask those kind of questions around that. Oh, great. Thank you, Becky. So they're also working with the National Safe Housing Consortium to work on more guidelines for comparable databases to the HMIS. So great. So let's think about some questions to consider as our folks are thinking about databases, and our programs are being told that if they're getting HUD funding, if they're accessing HUD funding, they should have a comparable database to HMIS, which is a very large database. I don't know how many of you have ever actually seen the HMIS database and all the questions that they ask, but they ask a ton of questions, lots of information. So we want to start thinking about, again, why is data collected and what's the purpose for that data, right? Are we collecting information on people that we're never going to use? It's never going to go anywhere. And if so, why have it if it's not actually something that is really useful. And what's the purpose? Because we know, right, it was just like this big Equifax breach that happened. Once you have people's data, right, somebody could breach it. And once data is breached and that information is out there, right, then, you know, in Equifax's situation, you know, it put, you know, we don't know how many millions of people's credit information at risk. But if it's a survivor, that can put their life at risk, right? So if my partner is able to find my information in a database, or if somebody who my partner is related to has access to that database and can look up my information and tell my partner where I am, those things can put me at risk. And I think sometimes because technology has become such a part of our everyday lives that we sometimes forget how it can be used for not so good purposes. We want to think about what's the content of the record. So this is where we really start getting into what are we documenting, why are we documenting those things, where is the location of the data, so where is it being stored, who has access. This becomes critically important. And then how secure is the data? Thank you, Lori, for that resource. That's great for the Safe Housing Partnership. That is a really great website. Appreciate that. All right, so in terms of our questions to consider, so let's talk about client level versus aggregate data, right? So because it's so easy to identify, like I showed on that one slide, right? If you know my zip code, my gender, and my date of birth, you can figure out who I am, right? So 87% of the time. So with that client level data, because it's so easy to identify, we really want to provide much more aggregated numbers. And this is something that when your programs are reporting numbers to you, they should be giving things in aggregate form. When they are reporting information, if they're participating with HUD funding or their local COC, they should be giving that information in aggregate form. And HUD has said that DV programs are allowed to report their information in aggregate form without turning that information on. So it may be, depending on the COC and the community, you know, some of them are very understanding and they totally get it, and then other ones, there might have to be a little bit more vigorous advocacy that takes place to maintain that information. So when we look at this, we don't want to provide we don't want to give any details about one person or family, right? So we don't want to say Tanya Moultrie, African-American female, 47, one child, right? We don't want to put all that information out there about one person, right? What we really want to provide is information that looks much more, right, like this. So if you're doing individual entries in a database, right, and you were to give their age, you were to give their race, you were to give the age of their first child, the race of their first child, this becomes an easy person to identify, especially if you have a smaller Asian population in your community. So if this is the only Asian family in the community and this gets into your stats, I can easily identify who that person is, right? Versus no details about one person, right? So this is where you're giving out kind of much more of my grouped numbers, right? So you don't know who I am based upon, you don't know, you just know from 0 to 18 years old, you serve 24 people, right? 18 to 25-year-olds, you serve 13 people that fell into that age range, and there's no identifying information in there. So always giving information in aggregated form. And if it feels like, you know, if we're asking about race and it is just that one Asian family, then I really need to figure out, like, how do I report that information, right? Do I need to have more generalized categories versus saying Asian? And once I put that down, that still identifies that family. So it can become still very easy for that family to get identified that they receive services. So when we also think about the data that we're recording, that can also break confidentiality if it's found out. And the reality is that the records at the DV shelter may be easier for the batterer's attorney to go after than it is, say, their counseling records or their substance abuse counselor records, right? So, or my medical records. So the attorney may look and be like, oh, I can go get those shelter records really easily. And we know that batterers go after shelter records. We know that, at least in my experience, typically we were able to get things quashed, but it was much harder if we were in a custody case, right? So in a custody case, the juvenile court judge may absolutely order, or the family court judge may order that we need those records to make a determination, right? And what we want is we want those records to be as little information as possible, right? So in DV, less is more in terms of us documenting, right? We don't want to document, and you'll get people that come out of the social work field who were taught, right, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. And in domestic violence, we don't want to write everything down because if that information gets pulled into court, it can be very damaging for the survivor, right, and for their children. And remember, a lot of times these things, in terms of our records getting pulled in, this may be 2-3 years down the road, so, she or he has left, and now they've gone through the divorce, and now there's a custody fight, right? And so how a survivor responded, reacted, what was going on with them 2 or 3 years ago in shelter when they were highly traumatized looks very different from who this person is now. And yet that information from this shelter can be taken completely out of context. And so we want to be very careful about what we're writing down so that we don't do any harm to survivors. So we don't necessarily want to put, counseling 1 hour July 5th, right? So, that could be a little revealing, right? So what sort of counseling were you doing? Was that mental health counseling? We know that batterers love to latch on to mental health counseling and start talking about how survivors have mental health issues, which makes them incapable of taking care of their children or whatever the case is, versus that we were doing an intake or spent time talking to a survivor, right? We don't want to ever put a safety plan in the file, but we can absolutely put like a note, like revise the safety plan, those kind of things. What we definitely don't want to do is put things like we made a suicide referral, right? Or, so that obviously is, survivors may be suicidal when they first come to us, and we want to address those things, and we want to work with survivors through that. So it's not that we're not providing services. We're providing services. We just want to be careful about what we're writing down and what that begins to look like. Demographics are definitely important to collect. So this is where we get into information that funders want and how we're tracking that information. Again, we want that reported in aggregate. So when we think about those small communities, again, if it's the only family that has 6 kids, do we necessarily, how do we report that? That's where we get into that aggregate. In terms of our case notes and what we're recording in terms of data, we want to make sure that we're not writing down opinions, right? So when you're going out and you are sitting with a program and you're talking to them about, what information or how would you write a case note, you can easily give them a scenario and say, if you had a survivor that came in and you did an intake with that survivor and they reported to you that they had a substance abuse issue and they were, had some medical things going on, show me what a note like that would look like. So you can easily have, a worker jot down sort of a simple note for you right there if you want to kind of get a sense of what their writing style is, if not having to go into client files. Because again, if you're looking at client files to sort of get a sense of how are they recording this data, how are they doing their case notes, what is all of that looking like, then what you're going to be asking, you want to make sure you would ask that beforehand, but it's going to be really hard for them to fully redact that entire file because, again, it's not just going to be taking out the name. It's going to be making sure they remove any and all identifying information out of that file. So it may be easier for you to kind of create a scenario about a particular survivor and ask them some questions around how would they deal with this, how would they deal with that, if you didn't want to actually look in files. And again, does that create a treasure map, right? Does it create a pathway for a perpetrator to find out more information about a survivor? Let's say he didn't know that she was in treatment. He didn't know that she went to substance abuse counseling, or he didn't know she went to mental health counseling. But the moment we put down, referred to mental health counseling at Silver Springs, now this gives him a place, him and his attorneys, if they get hold of that file. Oh, now we need to go see if we can't get mental health records from Silver Spring. And again, remember, records and files may be easier to get if you're dealing with things like in a custody case where it's about best interest of the child. So now we want to think about where's the location of the data and who's authorized for access. Now, all of that in terms of what's recorded, that's true whether it's being handwritten. It's also true whether it's being typed into a case note. And if people have electronic databases and they are using that also to keep their case notes in, it needs to be just as short in there as it is on paper, right? So the rules shouldn't change. So they also want to think about how do they really want to use an electronic database. Are they only using it for tracking and grant reporting purposes? And if so, maybe I'm keeping a paper file still on clients and I'm only putting information in there for grant tracking purposes. If I'm using it as the full-on system, which a lot of these systems are set up to provide for case notes and all the rest of those things, then we want to make sure, like, what are those locks and those protections that are on there. We also, again, want to think about who has access to these things. So in terms of where data is stored, there's a couple places where data can be stored. So it can be stored on site. So all the information is kept in-house on computer or on a computer that's not connected to the internet. If it's not connected to the internet, that is absolutely the safest thing in the world, right? Because then there's no way anybody's going to be able to get in and tap into that computer or a couple computers and be able to access that or breach it, right? So that is highly secured, right, in that way. Most programs are not going to have computers that are not connected to the internet. In Ohio, I have one program that went, bought a computer, made sure that they took out the Wi-Fi chip and all the rest of the stuff, and made sure it wasn't connected to the internet. But that was one program, right? That means everybody else has a vulnerability, and we need to pay attention to that. Now, if it is under the control of the local program, but it's still stored off-site, so it's my data, right, but I have someone else is sort of holding on to it, and I'm storing it over here with company ABC, right, on their servers because I don't have the ability to have a server or to maintain a server, then I'm going to need to have some sort of contract with those folks about who has ownership of the data, who has access to the data, who controls the data, right? If I decide I don't want to be with company ABC anymore, when can I get my data back? Right? So who owns that data becomes critically important. And ideally in this situation, the non-identifiable data about survivors if it is not under your control. So if that company says, well, you know, if our tech guy needs to get in, he may be able to see stuff, and that means I can't put anything into that database that would be identifying because I don't know who the tech guy knows, and that may cause a breach. If the data is not under our control, so this is something like a central database. So this would be something like HMIS, right, as a central database. We cannot share personally identifying information. So programs, ZD programs should not be putting any information into HMIS whatsoever because they have no control over that information when it goes out, right? And a lot of places are using HMIS as a case management tool. So it's linked so that if I'm a homeless person and I go to shelter A and I'm seeking services in shelter A, and I'm there for 30 days or whatever the case may be, and I didn't find housing, and they send me over to Shelter B can go into HMIS and they can see the information that Shelter A put in there about me, right? So HMIS has that capability. Maybe not everybody's using it that way, but we need to know that the whole idea, right, is that it's sort of linked, because what they're trying to track is instances of homelessness, right? So incidents of homeless, so how many times have I been considered homeless? And every time I move from shelter to shelter, that creates a new incident of homelessness. So there's a reason why HMIS is linked, but that also means that my confidentiality for the purposes of being a DV survivor cannot be maintained or secured in something like that. Cloud-based services. So we all hear about the cloud. I don't know if any of us know where the cloud actually is, right? But we trust the cloud, and we put all of our stuff into the cloud. So the cloud is obviously less expensive, right? So just in terms of cost-benefit analysis, it is definitely going to cost much less to put your information on a cloud. Again, an in-house server, having to buy the database, having to buy the software, right? It's a great budget option. So I'm going to put my information in the cloud. Well, the problem is that the cloud is maintained by a third party, and they update the equipment and they maintain it, and all of that is great, but that's not, right? This is this outside service that now has this. In general, those cloud-based companies will have basic security in place, right? So they're protecting the data. But you're going to find out what sort of security they're offering, right? And because it's in the cloud, it can get breached. It can be hacked, right, despite their security levels. It can be adaptable or flexible. So as an advocacy agency, if we grow, like all of a sudden we went from a small program of 5 people and we've got a bunch of new grants and we're doing all this amazing work, and now I've got a staff of 25, with a cloud-based service, I can easily expand, right, my service, my number of users, right? I have the ability to do that without having to go back through and purchase all new hardware. Here goes the drawbacks. Can the cloud-based tech company see your data? Can they inadvertently or on purpose share it? So what happens if the abuser figures out that XYZ company is the cloud-based service for ABC Shelter, right? And so they serve a subpoena on XYZ cloud-based service. Do they respond? Do they pull those records? Do they give those records over? If so, that's something that we need to think about, right? That's not a company. We don't want them just handing over the data. They shouldn't be able to access our data without our knowledge. Actually, they shouldn't be able to access it at all, right? We may not actually know who has our data. You know, just because I contract with XYZ doesn't mean that they're not handing it over to AAA over here, cloud-based service, because that's really who holds it, right? So those conversations, where is my data actually going to reside? Who's the company that I need to have my final sort of contract with and an understanding? As added protection, some cloud-based companies, and this is the only company that we know of right now, EmpowerDB, offer what's called zero-knowledge encryption, which means the company has zero knowledge of or access to the company's data. They cannot get in. They can't see anything. They have no way of accessing it. That is obviously the highest level of encryption, right? So we want to make sure that our DV programs are asking those kind of questions. How are they protecting the data, right? How is it secured? People can obviously get things on their personal devices. And while this feels like this is a great thing to be able to do, the more places we access data, the more we open up that data to being hacked, right? So accessing data from anywhere, right, is often one of those things that they're like, yay, right? When your advocate is sitting in court, they can be working on doing notes. They can upload information instantaneously about what just happened with that survivor's court case, right? When they just finished a counseling session, they can go ahead and upload that information. They can write their case note right there in the moment. They can do it right from support group room, right? They don't have to be on site. And that's a great benefit. But the more points where data can be accessed, the more vulnerable it becomes. All right, and we all know that because if you have your phone, you know your phone can pick up Wi-Fi everywhere you go, but not every Wi-Fi signal is as secure as the signal that's in your home, right? That's data encrypted. So if it's an open system that you're on, then you're on it and everybody else is on it, and that opens up that information to being vulnerable. It may require access to the internet, right? So if anything fails, the agency may not be able to even access it, right? So if the internet goes down for some reason, your Wi-Fi signal you lose, whatever the case may be, you may not be able to have access at all to any of your records until that's corrected. An in-house system, the benefits is the control. You own, as the agency owns it all, right? They have full control of the data, who sees it, how they get deleted. It's flexible, so they don't have to wait on someone to come and do it. It's confidential, and it's extremely private. So all of those things that we really want. But there are some drawbacks. The cost can be exorbitant to maintain all your own servers, to upgrade, and to do all those things. You're going to have to hire probably an IT person, whether it's through contract or they're going to have an IT department. And I don't know how many of your DV programs are large enough to have their own IT department. So now are they constantly having to contract out with somebody that can maintain their server, right? And in security, they still have to have security in place. They still have to pay attention to data breaches and those kind of things, user passwords, retention, destruction guidelines. And so that may be more than what a domestic violence program has the ability to focus on. When we start thinking about their retention and disposal process, so the goal is for them to keep the minimum amount of information for the minimum amount of time absolutely necessary, right? So when you're talking to your programs, how long do they maintain records for? I worked with DV programs that had every piece of paper they had ever had since the day that they opened, like 30 years ago, right? So this needs to be in writing. How long do they retain records, and then how do they dispose of records? Two different policies, right? Or it can be one policy, but on retention and then one on disposal. And this is true also if it's on an electronic database. We don't want to keep records for very long, but we want to keep records long enough. We don't have to follow, we're not under HIPAA guidelines, so we don't have to follow HIPAA guidelines. You can keep a file for 3 years, you can keep it less, but they need to be consistent. So whatever their policy says, they need to be disposing of it. Now, obviously, that file stays active as long as they're continuing to have contact with that particular survivor. So it may be we dispose of files 3 years after the last date of contact or something of that nature, right? However they choose to write that in there. They have to have quality assurances and purge any unnecessary information. So the other thing is that is there information that we need to, do we need to keep the entire file for 3 years, or are there things that we can purge sooner, right, than other information? So again, as a program, they need to sit down and make those decisions. If there is actual funder or legal retention requirements, so there may be something in their state that says they have to retain records for so long. And these are client files, right? So these aren't their business records. They're not personnel records. Those have different lengths of time that they need to hold on to those. Right? This is really their client file. So they need to make sure they're following whatever their state law is and then whatever else is guiding that. And they need to explain to survivors information may be asked for again because of purging. So if I was at your shelter 3 years ago and I come back and you're asking me all the same information and I'm like, I was here 3 years ago, you have my file, right? Someone needs to say, you need to know that after 3 years we purge all your records. Now, a survivor may choose to come back and get their own records, and that's perfectly okay. It's their information. It belongs to them. We should be willing to let survivors see their file. They shouldn't have to, wait 30 days and do a written request and all the rest of those things. There should never be anything in the file that we should be concerned about a survivor seeing. But if survivors want to make copies of their records, they can do that as well. But we also just want to make sure that they, too, are aware that they give that information to their attorney or somebody like that, they do lose control of that information. E-backup and e-destruction. One, they're going to need to have a backup, right? So if you have the cloud, where is it being backed up to? If you have your own server, how's it being backed up? How is information being destroyed or purged, right? So hitting delete is not the same as destruction of electronic records, right? And this is not just, we don't want to just destroy the records that are current. We want to make sure that we're also destroying the backup, right? So whatever they're looking at there when they're talking to these database companies, they need to be asking about that. Who's authorized to have access? So if they're under a larger organization, the whole organization, right, there may be like, oh, well, we just share files, or, you know, I work in the daycare center at this big program, and I know that I have a kid whose mom is in the DV shelter, and so I want to come and see this kid's records or talk to one of the staff about what's going on with that child. That person needs to have a release, right? So if they are receiving FIPSA funding for their DV program, the confidentiality belongs to the FIPSA program, right, the FIPSA-funded program. It doesn't cover the entire agency, so everybody and anybody can't just come in and see those files. They need to make sure if they are in a program where they will have both substance abuse, mental health, DV services, other services, there needs to be written releases between those programs in order for them to get access to that information and to decide what is being shared. Just because we work in the same agency doesn't automatically mean you have access to the file. And so those are things that programs need to be really clear on, and they need to be willing to advocate for. There needs to be different levels of access for volunteers, program staff, and supervisors. So again, files should be locked. Nothing should ever be left laying around. If you have intake forms that folks are doing, and let's say you have volunteers answering your hotline, so maybe all they ever do is the intake form, and that goes somewhere and it gets put into a file if a file is created, right? Or maybe there's just a huge file that's just intake, that's just telephone logs, right, that we keep of people that call in and stuff. That information is very different than once I have an active file. You know, maybe that's in my case manager's office, maybe it's in the general advocate's office, because anyone on staff can write in my file, right? That just has to be decided. There's not a right or wrong, but we just need to make sure that it's clear and consistent. If you have a database, everybody needs their own personal login. You want to know who's accessing what files and when, who's writing what in files, and that can get tracked back through people's individual logins. So you never want to have just one login for your crisis line workers. Each one of them, if you have 10 crisis line workers, you need to have 10 individual passwords for them, along with all the rest of your staff. There may be things that supervisors or programming staff have access to that other people don't have access to, or you also may be able, you want to find out, or the programs want to find out, if certain people only have the ability to purge or to destroy records. So maybe that's only a function that's given to executive director and to the clinical supervisor if there's one, or the shelter manager or whomever, right? So you want to make sure that this is really clear. And it should be spelled out in their policy. Who is responsible for destruction of records, where are records maintained, who has what level of access. How secure is our data? So this is just a little slide that just talks about data breaches, right? So when we think about, right, from the 5,396 data breaches made public since, and this was in 2005, right, the number of records that have been breached, that is huge, right? And this was back in 2005, so you can only imagine, right? So add Equifax and all the other records that we hear about that get breached on a regular basis. No database is ever completely secure, and I think that this is just critically important. It's a little story, so just thinking about sort of this federal employee who used the Homeland Security database to stalk his ex-girlfriend. So this is, I'll give you kind of a couple seconds to just sort of read through that and just kind of absorb sort of what's being said in there. And the whole point of this is that no database is 100% secure. So we just always have to be on the lookout. We have to be aware as advocates, as we venture into dealing with technology and using databases, we have to really think about what does that mean? How can we make our databases as secure as possible? We know at some point, more than likely, somebody's going to try to hack in. How do we protect that information? So is it zero encrypted? What will people see if they get in? What does that look like? And then finally, this is our techsafety.org. You can go to this website. So this is our safety net, folks. They have an amazing confidentiality toolkit. Has all sorts of information laid out around the different confidentiality statutes, VAWA, VOCA, and FIPSA, where they compare and contrast. It also talks about implementation, excuse me, and some FAQs. There's a best practices toolkit in there for agencies. They also have a really good document or blog that they created where they looked at several different database companies that say they do victim services work that they compared. So it's just sheets of the same information where they ask the same questions and those answers. So we never say get this one or don't buy that one, but so that agencies can compare and contrast and make the best decision for themselves possible. This is the contact information for our safety net team, and this is all of their lovely little pictures at the bottom. So if you ever needed to contact them, you can reach them through myself or Beth, or you can contact them directly at safetynet@NNEDV.org. Any one of them would be more than happy to respond to you. And we're going to take questions. We're right at 4 o'clock, and I want to honor your time. So thank you so much for being on the phone.